everybody. I'm David Bernard. Welcome to the David Bernard Podcast. This is episode 1, the very first one. Not only is it the very first David Bernard Podcast, it's the first podcast that I've actually hosted. So bear with me and cut me a little slack, if you will. But I'm excited about this. So we're going to try to do one of these every week to 10 days, talking about all kinds of issues related to meteorology, the environment, and the climate, not just here locally, but whatever may impact us across the nation or across the globe. And I think we should have some really interesting guests along the way. I always welcome suggestions from our viewers. And if you have ideas for the podcast, you can send them to me at my email, dbernard@fox8live.com, or on my social media channels at David Bernard TV on Facebook and Twitter, or on Instagram, just at David Bernard. Today we are going to start with Lauren Nash. She is the new Warning Coordination Meteorologist at National Weather Service Slidell. It's a big title. She's new to Southeast Louisiana, a very bright woman, and she has some innovative ideas that I think are going to enhance our weather coverage across the entire region. All right, I'd like to welcome Lauren Nash to the podcast. She is the Warning Coordinating Meteorologist at Slidell, the National Weather Service in Slidell. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
You are new to Southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, arriving this summer. In fact, arriving kind of right in the middle of it all. Where were you before this, and what was going on when you moved to the New Orleans area?
Yeah, so right before I came here, I was at the Tallahassee, Florida office for 2 years. And my first day was the day before Sally made landfall. And if you guys remember, that Sunday, Sally was still expected to track directly over New Orleans and Slidell. So I had to call my manager, my boss, on Sunday and say, I have an apartment in New Orleans. Like, can I get to work? Can I get home? What do I need to do? Do I need to get a hotel? I was just like a member of the public, unsure of what the impacts were where I was at. So my very first day, I walked in and said, hey, I'm Lauren. What can I do to help? And sat down and tried to answer some phones to see what I could do.
Right into the pot, as they say, the boiling pot, as it was, also known as the Gulf of Mexico, this past summer. Let's talk a little bit about your job, Warning Coordinating Meteorologist. I mean, the title sounds pretty obvious what you do, but there's a lot of different layers to it. It's not just hitting a button and issuing a tornado warning.
Yeah, I think the title is still pretty left over from, the early 90s when that was kind of the main job. Even when I first started in the Weather Service, which was in 2010 when I was in New York City, sometimes the WCMs would call each other. The WCM from Boston would call and say, I want to talk to the WCM and let's talk about where we're going to issue a winter storm warning. So in some regards, there was some coordination back probably before we had all of these tools and we communicated more on mostly warnings. Now we talk to each other in the office, the forecasters talk to each other, but you're right. There's a lot more that goes into it. We're kind of the people that create the preparedness and outreach program in the Weather Service. So any kind of communications we have with the media or our core partners, emergency managers, the public, any of that sort of stuff falls under us. We also are responsible for the products that come out. So anything that goes out to the public or goes out to our partners really falls under our jurisdiction to kind of make sure that our partners understand it, our public understands it, in dealing with anything that pops up, anything that comes with warnings, watches, forecasts, or anything with our partners.
I think it's interesting looking at your background. You have a bachelor's in meteorology, but I also found it interesting you have a master's degree in public affairs. And so just like our job on the TV side involves more than science, it's a lot about communicating as well. You seem to be merging those two backgrounds together when it comes to your position.
Yeah, my goal was to kind of get some sort of governmental public affairs degree. We're not in business, so I wanted like an MBA, but for government. So that's essentially what the MPA was. So it went into a lot of like administrative law, budgeting, political situations, how to manage that, managing the public. And that was really what worked out well for me. And we did do some public affairs related communications as well. So I wanted to merge those two. And my job, while I don't deal with politics per se, government and emergency management partners are involved in politics. So we are loosely aware of what's going on and having to deal with some of those issues as well. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, let's get to, I want to touch briefly on the 2020 hurricane season. And I thought to myself, well, I don't want to touch briefly on it. I guess we're going to talk a lot about it. It was kind of like, well, it's January. Do people really want to hear about the hurricane season? But this is really the time of year when the research scientists and others can step back, and emergency managers, and look at what happened and kind of analyze it all and see if we've learned anything from it. Now, first of all, I gave you a fair warning, okay? We were in 7 cones this hurricane season. I mean, I didn't even realize it was 7 until people started telling me that. Everything started running together. Do you know the 7 cones?
I think whenever you were telling me that, I think I got 6 of them. I will say towards the end of hurricane season, I kept messing up all the Etas, like Delta, Zeta, Eta, right, trying to figure out where all of those were. But, I was here for, let me see, so Zeta, Delta, and Sally. And then I know you had Laura, Marco, and Cristobal. So I think Eta was the 7th.
Beta.
See, I can't get my Etas confused.
Let me tell you, Lauren, I had to think about that too. I had to go back and check. I'm like, what is the 7th cone? I'm like, Beta. That's right. We are on the eastern edge of the Beta cone. Kind of crazy.
Eta was the one. Wasn't Eta the one, or was it Iota? See, I don't know. That went into the Central America and then went up to the Keys and went around Florida.
Yes, it did like a double landfall in Florida.
Yeah.
Eta, right. So one of the few that stayed away from us, and Florida didn't really see much this year. I mean, the southern half of the peninsula, they got lucky. All right, so we had these. We had a record 5 landfalls. 5 of those 7 made landfall. Cristobal, Laura, Marco, Delta, and Zeta. Let's kind of talk about each one of those, because one of the observations I've made from the season is that particularly 3 of the storms, if you look at Laura, and if you look at Sally, and if you look at Zeta, they all presented what could have been different challenges, particularly for Southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, even though we did have some impacts from all 3 of those, Zeta being the most direct. Let's start with Laura. And we're going to talk more about Hurricane Michael and your experience with that in a little bit. But Laura was another one of these storms that rapidly intensified right off the Louisiana coast, way overperforming all of our intensity models. And, we always say the emergency management mantra is you prepare for a category higher. Well, some of these storms end up being 2 or 3 categories higher than maybe is anticipated 48 to 72 hours. What kind of challenges does that face for you?
I think one of the biggest challenges is something you mentioned a little bit, is people aren't expecting rapid intensification. There's been this understanding that hurricanes weaken right before landfall. Quite a few of the ones that have hit Louisiana have over time. And so I think people just think that's how it goes. And we have had quite a few in this year, and quite a few in general, that have rapidly intensified. Like you said, our track forecasts, they're getting better every year. They're remarkably good compared to what they were, but we still have a lot of room to go with intensity, both from the human side and the model side. What's important to me is to talk a little bit about the fact that we have to remember to look outside of category also. So how do we get people to make decisions not just based on category, and based on everything, because of these situations that do happen?
And that really brings us into Sally. That's a nice segue into that. Sally also rapidly intensified, but even more importantly, Sally was very slow moving. And really, our nightmare scenario, especially when you're talking about threats to the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, as the Corps and the scientists like to call it, everyone else knows it as the levees. That's really kind of the worst case scenario for us. And the storm was actually making an approach, which is the worst case for Lake Pontchartrain, a storm coming from the east-southeast, maybe toward Lake Bourne, toward the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. That had the potential to put the most water there. So talk about a Sally type scenario.
Yeah, Sally was interesting from a track perspective, and how that made that right turn at the end. And we that was really a difficult one with it going straight into New Orleans. But we had been starting to hedge that forecast to the east, and between our communications with our government officials and with the Hurricane Center, it seemed that there was enough confidence it was going to go just enough to the right that it wouldn't have been as a worst case scenario as it could have been for sure. And we communicate with all of them about the river levels, the surge heights. All of that matters when it comes to the city. It, I can't say New Orleans got lucky. We got hit, and there's a lot of people in in Louisiana that obviously did not have good years. But Sally was good that it went to the east for us, but obviously not good for Alabama. That was a very nerve-wracking one, at least for me and for the office, given that track.
Me too.
And we just, yeah, that one was just so interesting to me. The track was so interesting to me, how quickly it changed there at the end. And it can show you how we still don't know 2 days out what these high pressure systems are going to do, what these fronts are going to do.
Well, and when you talk about a storm moving 2 miles per hour, it only takes subtle changes in the atmosphere
Right.
to maybe get drastic changes in the track. It was not a very well forecasted storm. It was probably one of the most poorly forecasted storms of the season.
Of the year.
It was just really, really difficult. I mean, we had a person we interviewed who evacuated from New Orleans to Orange Beach. Now, we never evacuate to barrier islands, right? I mean, that's like kind of should be the first lesson. But, the messaging in this in the beginning was, it seemed to be coming this way, even though we try to emphasize the cone.
Right. I was going to say that.
The center line. So, yeah, Sally was definitely a challenge. And to go to your point earlier about we need to get people to prepare regardless of the category, I think a parallel to that would be Hurricane Isaac that we had here in 2012 because it was such a slow-moving storm. It was a Category 1, but it took almost 2 days to cross Southeast Louisiana, and we had tremendous storm surge flooding as a result.
Right. Yeah, the slow movers are very difficult. Rainfall, especially for a lot of our parishes in Southeast Louisiana, rainfall is a huge threat. And if anything, one of the most dangerous ones out here with flooding and freshwater flooding too. So that's something that people very easily overlook in these slow moving hurricanes. So between rainfall and, like you said, just these small little changes can have huge impacts. And what you said about Orange Beach, Orange Beach and Gulf Shores were always in the cone. And we've gotten very lackadaisical when it comes to trusting that center line and not realizing that the cone is still, 1/3 of the time that center can still go in that cone. And that was something that I think really got a lot of people in Sally.
Well, and, I'm fighting an uphill battle, but, I don't show the center line as a rule on TV. Of course, the app shows the center line and other places show the center line. So I'm kind of, it's my own little way, though, I like to communicate it because of the very reasons that you were saying. All right, let's talk finally about Zeta, our one major impact that we had in Southeast Louisiana for the season. And Zeta was interesting from a number of perspectives. One, it was so late. Two, it was another storm that was intensifying faster than what the models had projected, even in what you would describe really as marginal conditions, or so it seemed. And three, it was moving so fast. It was incredibly fast for a Gulf storm and for one to move across our area. Why don't we address each one of those and some of the impacts?
Yeah, you're right. And I think that's a big thing with 2020 is making people realize every storm is different. Just because one slowed down and turned doesn't mean the second one's going to slow down and turn. Or just because one rapidly intensified doesn't mean the second one's going to. So yeah, Zeta was another one. And especially that late in the season for it to, like you said, go that quick, not make a right turn and intensify all the way up to landfall was very difficult for us to explain to people and to be prepared for that category higher. A lot of people bank on that Cat 3. And we saw it with Michael, and we've seen it in social science where they say, if it's a Cat 3, I'll leave. And we heard a lot of things. Well, if I would have known it would have been a high-end Cat 2, I would have left. Well, hopefully we've taught some people that we're not perfect, that these things are still a forecast. These are still predicting the future. And everyone needs to understand, what their personal impact is. So what can your household, what wind speed, what flooding, and try to make a decision based on that, and our emergency managers. But Zeta was very difficult to communicate, especially after how many cones? 6, 7?
Seven. Remember Beta.
That's right.
It's really interesting, the psychology of all that. I mean, first of all, with Zeta, the biggest impact we ended up having were power outages. And that's kind of what we anticipated. We weren't expecting a major storm surge impact with a rapidly moving storm from the southwest like that, especially for areas around the city and the immediate east and west bank parts of St. Bernard. But almost the entire metro area lost power at some point. I think it was like a 90% outage, including on the North Shore. We had huge power outages around Mandeville and Covington, and some of these lasted over a week. And, that's the modern hurricane. There's so much that revolves around us using power. It becomes really a hardship pretty fast.
That's very important. And we had learned after Michael too, that we need to talk about power outages more, what are actually going to impact people, and power outages are huge. People that are on oxygen, people that need medication, refrigerated, things that people don't normally think about when it comes to power. And even a relatively, weak storm in some areas, I'm not saying out in St. Bernard, but in some areas can lose power very easily, even if it looks like the lines are okay. Something I thought about with Zeta, though, that I'm not sure if it was an impact or not. It was just something I thought of. We'd had so many hurricanes before, and, power companies send their crews from all over the country to help. And after Sally and Laura, I kind of was concerned how many power crews were left, how many were available to come help us and had the money, and did we have the money, and how quickly could we get poles and lines. And there's a lot to think about with Zeta and power outages. And I think we can all do a better job of reminding people how important those power outages, how impactful.
And just this was one interesting thing also going on during Zeta. And I'm sure you remember this once I tell you, one of the worst earliest ice storms on record was hitting Oklahoma. Most of Oklahoma did not have power at the end of October. In many parts of Oklahoma, their power was out longer than ours was with Zeta. So you had resources from North Louisiana and Arkansas and Kansas that were all in Oklahoma dealing with the ice storm.
Yep. I forgot about that. That was a pretty crazy week. I remember in the Weather Service, it was this battle between, is the hurricane and hitting New Orleans or the ice storm? We got to focus on all of it. All of it's impactful.
And both of those were unusual for such a severe ice storm for so early in the season for Oklahoma, and then for us to have such an impactful hurricane at the very end of October. All right, well, the last topic on hurricanes I guess I wanted to talk about was your experience with Hurricane Michael. I remember in 2018, I went over along 30A. I went to Rosemary Beach in Panama City. And a friend of mine is a meteorologist there in Panama City, and I met him for lunch, and I said, hey, do you see those thunderstorms down in the Caribbean? He goes, oh, yeah, we're keeping an eye on it. I'm like, yeah, I wonder if that's going to do anything.
Kind of what we were all thinking.
Michael. Yes, exactly. So how did you become, quote, embedded in Hurricane Michael as far as the emergency management system goes?
Yeah, and Michael was interesting. I don't know if you heard this stat, but I think it was like all the Cat 5s that have made landfall were tropical storms, like 72 hours in advance. They all rapidly intensified. But Michael was also a new one for me. I got to Tallahassee the first week of August. So 2 months later, we got hit with Michael. So I guess I just have a thing with hurricanes attracting me to new locations. But I was still new. My manager had only been there, I think he said 46 days when Michael made landfall. And we didn't do a whole lot of deployments at that time to the emergency operations centers, but other offices had. We had in New York and some other offices. So we woke up that Monday and he sent me to Leon County, which is where Tallahassee is. But also Leon County is kind of what I like to term an umbrella county. So when the surrounding counties go down, like their 911 systems, or they need resources, they're going to get that resources from Leon. And then a coworker actually went down to Bay County, which is where Panama City is. And the good thing about that is just having a meteorologist there for the partners 100% of the time. There's, 50, 60 agencies in that room, 100, 150 people, all with varying questions and needs and requests. Instead of having to call us up every 5 minutes, they can walk up to us and ask us a question.
And if I remember right, so you missed most of the main impacts from the storm, right? Weren't you far enough east?
Yeah, so Tallahassee, we had maybe 60 to 70 mile per hour gusts. We lost power, for 3 to 4 days. But a couple of years in 2016, Hermine had come through Tallahassee and knocked out power for like 7 to 10 days. So they had done a lot better job with Michael on the resources and making sure we were up. So yeah, our biggest impact was power outages locally. We did go and survey though afterwards, for high water marks. And, I know a lot of people saw what happened after Laura, and, Mexico Beach, Panama City was exactly the same, if completely slabbed, and it's still not very recovered down there, Tyndall Air Force Base and whatnot. So it was a pretty devastating event for the Panhandle for sure.
It sure was. I mean, that's the heart of, Panama City. It's all about that Air Force Base. I mean, that is basically the economy there. And the base, of course, suffered major extreme damage. Okay, shifting gears here, let's talk about messaging. And I know that's near and dear to your heart. You've been working with us, the media, through the hurricanes this year as our partner. And, we have some of the same challenges in broadcasting that you do with the National Weather Service. And, with the digital age, people are getting information all over the place. And most of the time that's good, but it can also cause confusion. How do you see your role in that? And have you noticed any difficulties with messaging warnings and watches and the advisories that y'all put out from the National Weather Service in Slidell?
Yeah, it's like you said, it's related to what you all do too. And we rely on our broadcast meteorologists to help us message that. Broadcast meteorologists are still one of the highest ways people get their information during severe weather and tropical weather. So it's important for us to all be on the same page, kind of messaging the same thing. Two biggest problems I've seen is one, just people getting information. Do they have a smartphone? Where are they getting it? An app? What if they don't have cable? So many people don't have cable these days. So making sure that information gets to people. But like you said, the second problem is the fact that everyone thinks they're a meteorologist. I was reflecting very recently on Hurricane Sandy and how we saw Sandy coming, 7 days out in the models, but the models weren't online at that point. So nobody had access to it. Nobody saw it coming, and we could control the entire message. So we could control when we started talking about it. Nowadays, people can see hurricanes coming at day 10 online, and there is this false sense of security that because it's there at day 10, that means it's going to hit that. And unfortunately, a lot of people on their own Facebook groups or, just on their own personal Facebook can grab these model images and, kind of spin the conversation the way they want it, the way they want to. So that's a huge challenge for us right now.
And then of course, there's the issue of, and we're going to kind of talk about a little of this out of order, but it got me thinking about it, is are people being overwarned? And from two standpoints, are they getting too many warnings and too much information on their phone that causes them to kind of block that out? And are we, as a community, maybe warning too often for certain types of storms? And I'm referring to specifically severe thunderstorms and also flooding to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where the lack of understanding of probability comes in sometimes with the public. Of we're warning for a deterministic event that may not have 100% chance, and every storm is different. And the way I try to tell people with severes and tornadoes, especially tornado warnings, I say, how long does it take you to take shelter? And how long are you in the shelter for? 10 minutes, maybe? How long does it take you to get away from the windows in a severe? 30 seconds? If that could potentially save your life and that one time that something bad happens, then it's worth it for me. Maybe we are overwarning. Maybe it's a factor of just people thinking, okay, well, this hurricane didn't hit me, so this one's not. And how do we communicate? Pay attention to each storm, get the information. Don't just look at there's a hurricane warning. That's important to me for sure.
Now, of course, the hurricane warnings and the tornado warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings are two totally
slightly different
ball games. Well, some people think that, they get like this season, people got fatigued toward the end of hurricane season. They thought another hurricane warning, another voluntary evacuation. A lot of people just said, I can't do this anymore. Not to mention, we haven't even talked about the underlying situation with COVID. That was a big part of this hurricane season. Is still a big part of what's going on. But I guess with the severe thunderstorm warnings, my thought has always been, they'd have raised the criteria for severe thunderstorm warnings, particularly for hail, which I think is good. But it's 58 miles per hour or greater for a severe thunderstorm. And most of the time, a 60 mile per hour wind is not going to do, I think, major damage.
Widespread damage.
Exactly. And so, my thought is maybe those winds should be raised just a little bit. But even if you don't do that, because like you said, it's a probabilistic thing, right? Because, you're issuing for a storm that's going severe or appears severe, but you don't necessarily know what's going to happen on the next 2 or 3 radar scans. It could get even stronger. So sometimes you have to kind of preempt a little bit.
And that's the goal. And when people talk to me about, I always get tornado warnings and nothing happens. And I say, well, we're trying to look at the storm at 10,000 feet or 5,000 feet, 2,000 feet even, and try to guess if a tornado is going to form and give you enough lead time on that tornado that's going to form at the lowest 500 feet in the atmosphere. Severes are incredibly difficult. 58, 60 mile per hour winds can do a good amount of damage. I think the problem is most people don't typically see 60 mile per hour winds in a severe thunderstorm. I won't name the severe thunderstorm I'm thinking of right now, but there was a situation where it was just a normal run of the mill thunderstorm and it created some damage. And someone I knew said, well, this was a bigger thunderstorm. This was a stronger thunderstorm. I said, no, this was a normal severe thunderstorm. It's just that a lot of people don't experience an actual severe thunderstorm when they have it. And like you said, it's also very, spotty. My neighbor could lose a tree and I could not lose a tree. And on paper, that verifies the severe thunderstorm warning that we're required to submit to our national headquarters. So we have some challenges locally between making sure we're issuing good warnings and that we're verifying those warnings, but also making sure we don't miss anything. And I've had coworkers tell me, well, one tree could kill someone. So I want to make sure I get all of those trees. And that's, it's not a horrible mindset, but it does overwarn a lot of other people.
And take us inside the National Weather Service a bit when we're having a severe weather event. Put hurricanes aside for a second, but say we have a spring cold front coming in with the possibility of a line of severe storms, a squall line, maybe supercells, some tornadoes. We do have tornado days in Southeast Louisiana. Usually one big one every couple of years. Noticeably, we've had a few lately. What does that look like inside the Weather Service? What's that decision-making process look like?
Yeah, so whenever we have those days, we have 1 or 2 people, sometimes more depending on the day, dedicated to radar. So, their job is to sit there and watch every scan of radar come in and make decisions on warnings. When you have somewhere like Tallahassee where they have 4 radars that are surrounding their area, that's a lot of data. Even here we have 2 or 3 radars we can refer to depending on where the storms are. We look at the environment. So we look to see, what is the environment supportive of? We look at, I know I do, what's happened upstream. So if we have storms coming from the Shreveport or Lake Charles area, did they get reports? Did their tornadoes touch down? Did they produce severe winds? Because if you look at a storm and you say, okay, this storm produced quarter-size hail, and this storm is even stronger, then maybe we should say golf ball size hail. So we try to get an idea on that. But, we talk a lot in the office. So even if you're not the warning desk, there's a lot of communications going on. Hey, what do you think of this storm? Or did you see that signature at, 2.5? And then we make sure the other people know, hey, I'm going to issue a warning on this. So then we can talk about it to our partners. We can post it on social media. But we try to make it as much of a team decision as we have time for sure.
Okay, so speaking of warnings, let's go back and talk about the wireless emergency alerts. WEA, as we call them, you and me and that sort of thing. But as the public knows them, the really loud alert you can get on your phone that's issued by the government. So not the alert you might get from the Fox 8 weather app. This one is coming directly from the federal government. It went off, for instance, when we had the lockdown, the stay-at-home orders at the beginning of COVID. It was triggered on a lot of people's phone, which was an unusual situation. But the WEAs can be issued by the government for tornado warnings, right? And there's been a change, though. They used to issue them for flash flood warnings, but there's a little bit of a change to that.
Yeah, and that's going to be coming for severe soon as well. So I can kind of talk about that. We have what I want to call maybe tiers to our flash flood warnings now, which maybe is a good word, maybe it's not. But we have our base flash flood warning, which is still hazardous, but, kind of there's water over the roads. You shouldn't go through flooded roads, whatever. That used to trigger those WEA alerts. Now, when you're in areas like this that get flooded a lot, different thresholds, different warnings, it was producing a lot of warnings. And we have now a couple different tiers. So if you go one tier up from that, it would be like a considerable flash flood warning. This is basically, we know there's flooding going on. There's more rain coming. This is going to be a life-threatening situation. We don't want you out and about. We don't want you driving. We need you to know about it. And at that level now is where the WEAs are going to be alerted. And then on top of that, we have the flash flood emergency. So that's what it is. It's an emergency. People are being rescued from cars. This is a very, very rare life-threatening situation. And that would also be WEA alerted as well. So the base flash floods are still going to be important. They're always important, but it will cut down on those alerts a little bit.
Yeah, I guess. And for here, it's like, where's the boundary between the street flood advisory and the flash flood warning? I always took the flash flood warning to mean that we now have water entering structures, or the water is so high that cars could literally float.
Right. And the city, especially, and even in Southeast Louisiana, very difficult to figure out those thresholds. And it's something that we're going to be working on here locally too. We have a new hydrologist with us at the office, and that's kind of on her plate. And we've been talking, at least with the city of New Orleans, on some of their thresholds, like what they consider flooding, what impacts they get. And that's something, big picture, we'd love to do with a lot of the parishes and a lot of the cities in the state as well.
Yeah, because between the North Shore and the South Shore and Mississippi, you've got very different topography and parishes and urban areas and non-urban areas, all of which flood quite differently. The most glaring problem, obviously, in the New Orleans metro area with the pumps, and if they're working, if they're not working, what's working. And I assume if we have a situation where we find out some major turbines are down or something like that, that would lower the threshold for issuing a flash flood warning.
Yeah, and especially if we know we're going to get rainfall rates over what their thresholds are, if we think we're going to get that. But we see you can get a strong thunderstorm in the city for half an hour and there's water over the roadways. And that typically is fairly normal in the city. It would be more of an advisory criteria. Like you said, if we're going to put a warning out, cars may get stuck, cars may float away, entering homes, things like that.
All right, so another WEA, wireless emergency alert, that could come out on their phone. On my phone, it's a real it's like kind of a real loud sound, is for storm surge watches and warnings.
Yeah.
And for everybody out there that may or may not know, the storm surge watches and warnings are issued now by the National Hurricane Center. Those are watches and warnings for rising water, for ocean, for Gulf water coming in with the storm. The hurricane warning is issued for wind, the danger of hurricane wind. Now, one problem we've run into, though, is that so far, thank goodness, we have not had storm surge watches and warnings issued for areas inside the risk reduction system. So people that are protected by levees, we haven't had a situation recently since Katrina where we've had watches and warnings inside the levee. But we have areas outside of Orleans Parish or in Orleans Parish that are outside the levee protection system. Same with St. Bernard and some of our other coastal parishes that do have those issued. Nevertheless, why do I get this storm surge warning if I live in Metairie on my phone, or if I'm in downtown New Orleans, even though it's not for me?
Yeah, and if you have to think about Southeast Louisiana, New Orleans is probably the only place in the country that has this problem.
Of course.
I don't think
add it
there's
to the
anywhere
list
that has, these inside and outside of the levee problems. So the way that the WIAs were set up for storm surge, were based on county by parish basis and, where a storm surge should go. And like you said, we have parts in these parishes that are outside the levees. And I will explain one thing we're changing next year that will help. But this is so important to know your risk when it comes to storm surge. So, you need to know if you're inside or outside of those levees. You need to know how to get information from your official, your emergency manager, and know if you're in an evacuation zone. When I was here during Sally, I got an alert on my phone. I said, am I in the levees? Am I out of the levees? Why do I need to do this? So I had to learn where I was, where to get information. And that's just something unique to the levees down here. But, for next year, at least for Orleans Parish and St. Tammany, we're splitting the parish into our different forecast zones. So for storm surge, there's going to be likely, we'll have to see how it goes next year, we'll be able to split like Orleans East out, which tends to have more area outside of the levees. And we might be able to leave the rest of Orleans out of that storm surge warning whenever we don't think it's going to overtop the levees.
And, the good news is, people like myself and on Fox 8, we're going to be very specific about what's going on.
Right.
I don't think it causes a ton of confusion, but certainly initially when this started happening a few years ago, we got pretty inundated with calls and messages about, hey, what's going on. So that's good. So we're going to try to streamline that process and maybe not hit as many people with a watcher warning that doesn't apply to them, because we certainly don't want that to be the case. Okay, we've got some news coming out of the Weather Service that I just found out about last week, although it's been talked about for some time around here. The Doppler radar that the National Weather Service in Slidell uses is in Slidell with the office. That makes sense, right? That's where most of the Doppler radars are located, adjacent to where the National Weather Service offices are. However, it is going to be moving to Hammond. Now, what does that mean for folks in Southeast Louisiana and, for that matter, Baton Rouge and areas to the west?
Yeah, so for one, we have some issues with flooding in the area. So the radar was going to have to move in some way. And our office is going to be moving too, eventually. In a couple of years, not too far away, but that was part of the transition plan. So the other thing I want to add about that is typically our radars are at 0.5 degrees. Like that's the first cut of the radar that we get. So with the move, we're going to be able to actually lower that to 0.3 degrees. So even though we're going to be moving west, the people in Southeast Louisiana and Mississippi aren't going to see much change in where that radar hits their area because of that tilt change. But for areas west, Baton Rouge, which is typically hit at maybe 7,000 to 8,000 feet right now with a radar beam, they're going to be getting about 1,000 feet in the radar beam, which means we're going to be able to see lower.
And that's been, a complaint from meteorologists in the Baton Rouge area and even south of there toward the Morganza Spillway, is that they're kind of on the outer edge of the Lake Charles radar and the Slidell radar, and so sometimes it's harder to see the storms. So the beam of the Doppler will go from 0.5 to 0.3. Now, this is where our marshes come in handy and our flat elevation, right? Because if we were in hilly territory, we wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why a lot of radars don't go that low, is because there's typically a lot more terrain. And, most of us have all been in offices with places with 6,000 to 7,000, 8,000 feet radar beam coverage. So we're pretty used to it now, of understanding that. But it's just going to be very helpful for those Western counties and Western parishes now to see, we're going to be able to see so much lower in the atmosphere. And it's not going to impact the Mississippi counties because mobile radar hits them at a pretty good level. And like I said, lowering it, we'll still be able to see them pretty well as well.
Okay, well, Lauren, it has been great having you on the podcast. I'd like to end with the question that I like to ask a lot of people, because I know my answer is Hurricane Alicia in 1983. That was my kind of wow moment. Like, okay, this is what I want to do. Where did you grow up? Did that influence your desire to be a meteorologist?
Yeah, I'm definitely one of the weird ones that don't have, a specific hurricane or a specific blizzard. But I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, so grew up with severe weather. And I was actually terrified of it. I hated it. I hated every second. I hated tornadoes. My mom used to make us go sit in the basement and we'd have the TV on and I just didn't want to listen to any of it. And I'd put a book in front of my face and I'd put my headphones on. And so eventually I got to the point where I said, maybe I'll learn about it. If I learned a little bit about weather, I wouldn't be so scared. And somewhere along that time frame, my parents caught that I liked math and science and caught the meteorology. And it's really, I don't want to say their fault. It's definitely a good thing, but I appreciate them picking up on all of that and kind of pushing me that direction young. And I don't know what else I would be doing. So I've always had an interest in weather. It may not have always been a positive interest, but it helped, I don't know, help me learn in a positive way about weather.
I did 3 years in Tulsa, so I'm very familiar with the weather in the Midwest. And, you had my pals, Brian Busby and Gary Lezak, on TV there, two
Yes.
really great meteorologists. And so obviously weather taking very seriously in Kansas City. Lauren with the National Weather Service in Slidell, the Warning Coordination Meteorologist, and she's somewhat still new to Southeast Louisiana, but already making some great contributions. Thanks for being on the podcast, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for episode 1 of the David Bernard podcast. I appreciate everybody listening, or if you happen to be watching the video version, thanks for tuning in to that. Both the audio and video versions of this podcast will be available on our website, fox8live.com, and the audio versions also available where you typically download other podcasts. A reminder to download our Fox 8 News and weather apps, and of course you can watch all of Fox 8 News streaming live on our website or on our news and weather apps. I'm David Bernard. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.